Hello arty peoples, and welcome to another episode of Jerry's Live. I am your host, Emmy Klein, and today we are going to fall down a rabbit hole of gouache. There is so many things when it comes to gouache. We have a lot to cover and like 17,000 tangents, and there's so many rules and not rules and a lot of things about gouache, which is why we dedicated an entire show just for you guys. Now, before we jump straight into it, I wanted to remind you all that we have our 9th annual self-portrait contest. So if you haven't gotten started, now is a really good time to do so because it ends on April 18th, 2021, in case you're watching in the future. But I know my team will be putting the links in the chat below, and if you are watching this in the future, if you want to find the description or the details on this contest, go to the website jerrysartarama.com, and in the top right hand side of the website there's a tab you can click on called Artist Resources. In there is a link to all of our contests. We have a ton going on at all times, but for this specific one, it is a self-portrait. All you have to do is paint or draw or whatever medium that you are very familiar with, because all media is accepted, except for photography, but all you have to do is a self-portrait. Now, the total prizes are $5,000. The first place gets $2,000 of those $5,000. So like I said, if you haven't started, now is the time to get started, because you know it's great practice even if you don't win, but there are honorable mentions and first, second, and third place, and you guys should really, I know you're gonna win. It's gonna be good. Now let's jump straight into this whole gouache mess. I have so much paint surrounding me right now. Now if you are interested in any of the paint that I talk about here today, or any of the like brushes or anything that I'm using, if you go to the website and you type in the code in the search bar JL187, which I believe, yep, here it is. The code is right here on the screen. That is today's class, is JL187. So that will bring up a teacher's cart with everything that I use, and you can very easily see the descriptions and details on those. Now, let's get straight into it. So first and foremost, what is gouache? Take a step back. It's pronounced gouache. I can't tell you how many times I've heard gouache, 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 I've heard so many different ways of how it's pronounced. It's gouache, just like you're washing your clothes in the washing machine, but with a g in front of it. Gouache. Now, what a gouache is, in its very basic description, is an opaque watercolor. Now, to take a step back from there, if you're not familiar with any of these, and I know some of you are very familiar with all the different details of like acrylics, oils, gouache, watercolor, I'm talking to those of you who may be starting off without any of that knowledge here. A watercolor is a water-based media that is transparent. You can pick it up with water, you can move it around, and then once it cures, it can actually be reactivated because the binder in watercolor is typically gum arabic, which is essentially a sugar. So it makes it sticky to your paper, but you know, just like if you put sugar in water, it will dissolve over time. So that's why your pigments are allowed to kind of be picked up and moved back around once they dry, and then you can move them back around. Now, if a gouache is an opaque watercolor, it has the same, I guess, kind of properties where you can pick it up with water, move it around your paper. It's not transparent because it has that opacity, so they usually will either add opacifiers, and we'll get into the details of how they make them opaque a little bit later. But it can still be re-wet once it cures on your paper. Now, Katie and I were just talking earlier, the word gouache has been kind of tossed around a lot lately, and there's not a basic industry standard like I just defined for you. The word gouache has been kind of a catch-all for anything that's kind of in between acrylic, watercolor, tempera. I mean, anything that dries to a flat matte surface people have been slapping the name gouache on it. Now, I know that makes it really confusing. So what I did is I took every item on the Jerry's Artarama website that had the word gouache in it, and I brought it here. So we're going to compare and contrast what all they are and what they do and what they would be maybe useful for. So as you can see, I have a nice chart here. And I, just in case you were wondering, I put them in ABC order so you didn't think that I was being, you know, biased. But I have my own opinions on these materials, but I'm going to try and leave that out of this because none of these are bad or wrong or something that you're not supposed to touch because it's not a traditional gouache as I defined. They all have their parts in the world, the art world. So, I mean, it's not that anything's wrong. So I just want to make sure that you know I'm not going to tell you whether or not this one's better than that one. I'm just going to tell you how they're different. So if you're looking for opinions, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry. So let's get started. Holbein. Let's start at the top and work our way down. So I happen to have that right here. And I believe Holbein on our website does not come in a set. They come in individual tubes. But I also made sure to lay out every single one of these paints. I laid them out on my palettes last week, so I let them dry completely. But I also, let's lay out these little swatch cards, because whenever you get a brand new paint, you need to swatch them. So let me try and make sure that they can kind of stay on camera here. I might have to like move this around here. There we go. And then I'm gonna pull this over because I know we're a little off center here with my picture in a picture. So as you can see, here are my swatches. I also just ordered the primaries if it didn't come in a set. So I just wanted to have just the basic colors for each different set. So Holbein, this paint, the binder for this, what the pigment is actually mixed in with this is gum arabic, which is exactly the same as watercolor. It also, on a lot of occasions, they use oxgall, which is a very traditional medium when it comes to watercolor, and that does not make this anything less than a watercolor with those two mixed together. That's very basic for watercolor. Now, oxgall is not always used in every single one of their pigments, but it's used often enough to where I can list that as like a medium. So let me write that here on our chart. We have gum, Arabic, and oxgall. Now, oxgall is a dispersant. It will make your pigments kind of flow a little bit better. So that's the binder for these. And as you can see, I did lay them out on my palette here. Now, one thing that is very normal with gouache, if you're using a palette like this, and you'll see it pretty consistently with everything that I've laid out, they will crack. They don't have a whole lot of flexibility to them. So with that being the case, and this is a non-stick palette, so as you can see, my chunks of paint will crack apart and move around on my palette. Now that does not mean that this is bad. That's just very traditional. That's what's going to happen with a lot of gouaches, especially if you use them in a palette like this. Now, if you want to avoid that, you can also lay them down in those watercolor palettes that come. I actually did add them to the teacher's cart. I thought about this last minute, so I didn't have them here to show you guys, but they come in the little metal tins and they have the little empty pans, or half pans and whole pans. They come in both sets. So you can actually squeeze your paints straight into those little pans and then pop them into your travel watercolor set, and then you can maybe even have a combination of watercolor and gouache depending on what you'd like to do. But that will avoid this cracking problem right here. Now, one thing I've done before, and it doesn't actually affect your paint, is that I've taken the tube of paint, squeezed out a little bit more, and then stuck those pieces right back into that little pile. Now that kind of sticks it all back together. Again, you are going to kind of have it still separate, but at least that way it'll be kind of stuck together. As you can see though, it's a very creamy consistency. So straight out of the tube, it's, I don't want to say this is like frosting because it's a little thinner than frosting, but it's very creamy, right? And it picks right up and it's quite concentrated. So if I wanted to lay this down without any water, I can. And if I get that super, super thick, it's going to crack if I have any kind of flexibility to my surface. Now paper can bend. Paper absolutely can bend, but I did not lay this paint down thick enough to where it's gonna crack. It's a pretty thin wash, but as you can see right here, and just to kind of explain my swatch cards here, this right here is the mass tone all the way down to a thin wash. This is a tint where I took the paint and then added it with black. And then, or I'm sorry, this is a tint, this is a tone. I'm mixing those two up, excuse me. So this is a tone where you take the paint and mix it with black. This is a tint where you take the paint and mix it with white. So that's your black and white mixed in. This is your mass tone. As you can see, it is very, very opaque, which is what I would expect a basic gouache to do. So I'm glad this was, I mean, it's in ABC order, but this is a very nice, solid standard, basic gouache. This is what I would consider, I think I have dog hair on here, sorry. My dog decided to come to work with me today. So anyway, this is what I would consider a very nice standard gouache. Now, the biggest question though is, does it re-wet? And let me get my brush nice and clean, so I'll go over here to this blue. Because remember, I laid this pile of paint down last week, so it's completely dry. I can actually pick my white paint up and just like hold it in my hand. It's also cracking, but just a little bit of water and it re-wets right again. So this is a definite, it does re-wet. So let's write this here. It's creamy for the consistency and the opacity. It is absolutely opaque and it is absolutely resoluble. So with the primaries, and I was just talking about this with Katie, I can tell you all the different pigments that go into all of these different primaries for each brand, but we don't have that kind of time. I do have quite a few notes here that list all that out, and I will be sure to upload this onto the Facebook Live group for you guys to actually check out, or I might have to add a link, but whichever way, I'll be able to provide this information to you so you can see the different pigments in each brand, because where you might see the same pigment kind of repeated in a couple of different brands, there is no base standard for a primary magenta, a primary blue, and a primary yellow when it comes to the actual pigment code. Now, I can tell you the ones that I've used here. So I've used a primary yellow, a primary magenta, and a primary cyan. That's the names of the colors that I used here. So that's what I'm gonna write down here. All right, so we have our primaries all set on this one. Now, if you do look at this, I did try to make sure to test out the primaries. Again, this is a very solid as far as the different primaries and mixability. So this blue and this yellow made a really, really beautiful green. The red and the blue made a really, really lovely violet. And the magenta and the yellow made a really nice orange. Now the orange, I would say for me, is just slightly desaturated. But that's just because I've been trained in color theory for many, many years, so I can kind of see that. Now, that would mean that something is in either the yellow or the red that would make that not look as bright as it should be. But as far as the primaries go, that is a very solid trio. So that is Holbein. Make sure I didn't actually, yep. Oh, the one thing I did want to tell you, the opacity of these are actually, it happens because of the pigments. They don't actually add in any opacifiers. So they didn't add in a white, they didn't add in any kind of a chalk or anything that's going to make this appear opaque. What they've done here is they've used natural minerals and pigments that are naturally opaque. So they've just shoved in a ton of pigments to where you can get that opacity without having to add in anything else. So when that happens, the opacity of paints kind of can vary just slightly. So like I know the yellow is not as opaque as that blue, but that's, I'm really looking for it, you know? But for, you know, all intents and purposes, that's a very opaque yellow. So that was Holbein. Let's
Quick
move.
question before you move in.
Yeah.
Is it considered an artist quality gouache?
This.
Holbein.
Holbein I would consider a professional level gouache. That's another terminology that is not a set industry standard. Some people say student grade, some people say artist grade, some people say professional. What that specifically means can vary across the board from brand to brand to brand. So I can tell you that this is a professional, not a student grade paint. That's the two categories I will usually separate paints into. I never say artist's paint because you never know where that lies on that scale.
Everybody's an artist.
Yes, everybody's an artist, whether you're a student or a professional. It just can vary greatly. So that is Holbein. I'm going to shove them down here because I'm running out of table space. All right, next we have a very, very different gouache. Let me actually keep it over here. Jack Richardson. This right here is extremely different from the Holbein I just showed you, which is hilarious because they're both labeled gouache. You would think that they would be the same, right? Sorry, there's a lot of colors in this. There's a total of 12, which is really awesome. Now this one does come in a set, which is why I ordered the set. Trying to make sure that you guys can see them all on the camera, sorry. All right, so 12 colors, and you can kind of ignore that little pile here. I'll just put that on top, like it never happened. Now this gouache comes in little jars. Now when I went to find out the binder on this one, I could not find that information. The reason why it is actually a proprietary information, so I'm not allowed to know. That they don't release that information, unfortunately, but it's just their trade secret, so you know I can't get mad at that. But what I can tell you is that as soon as I open this, it smells like Tempera paint. I don't know how else to describe it like that. If you have smelled Tempera paint, there's just that certain smell that it has to it. This has that. So I would assume, based off of that smell, that's probably what I'm getting. So binder on Jack Richardson is a big old question mark. But the consistency straight out of the jar, and I probably should have had a palette knife. The consistency straight out of the jar. Now I will say when you open these, I did notice that there was separation between the binder and the pigment. That does not mean your paints are bad. You just need to give it a good stir, you know. So the consistency of these paints, and they're all very consistent between all of the different colors. But as you can see, it's, put it over here so you, sorry, maybe I'm trying to make sure you can see it. It's not dripping off, but it's very fluid. So it's almost like an in-between frosting and melted butter, but it's still very creamy. So I'm just gonna take an easy wiper. Haha, I always have an easy wiper under my table and wipe it off. So that is, it's very creamy, but it is still on the thinner side. Okay, so then the opacity of these, which is where we go to our cards here, our swatches. So if you look at these, they are extremely opaque, and I'm looking right here on that mass tone, because when I did the tint where I mixed it with white, and then the tone where I mixed it in with the or the shade. I think, isn't that what it's called? Shade, not tone. My bad, I've been using the wrong word again. I do that on occasion. So when you mix a paint with a black, it's a shade, not a tone. Eventually I'll get these words right. So I'm not looking at those because when I did those, I was on occasion doing kind of a light wash. But what I'm really looking for as far as opacity is right there at that mass tone, right where I have the majority of that pure pigment just straight out of the tube. So as you can see, they are very opaque. Even that yellow is pretty opaque. Now I will say when I was painting with these, they dried a lot lighter than I was expecting them to, which makes me think that there's some kind of a chalk binder in there. And as you can also see, with the black being the exception, a lot of these paints are very chalky as far as the color is concerned. It's also in the feel of that the dry paint. It feels kind of chalky. So all of those things make me believe that there's probably some kind of a chalk binder in there. But again, it's proprietary information. I'm not allowed to know. So, then, oh God. It's really actually quite easy to take these in and out, which is really nice, I will say. I know somebody was talking about the opacity of these worked out really well for plein air painting. You know, they were enjoying them. So again, it's none of these gouaches are wrong for any specific type of painting that you're trying to do. It's just whether or not it works for you. So, you know, if you're looking for something that has this kind of a finish, this would be a great paint for you guys to use. So then the opacity, then resoluble. Let's go for this green here. So it does re-wet. I did not have a whole lot of water on my paintbrush. It does re-wet pretty easy. So again, just like a traditional gouache, it does re-wet, but based on the finish, it's one of those things where this lands in between like gouache and tempera, which if, I guess I should probably define tempera. Tempera is also a water-based media that is, usually the binder is like an egg yolk or something that's very glutinous, but when it dries, it's permanent. So the fact that this re-wets is more like a gouache, but it feels and looks like a tempera. So it's, again, there are so many different varieties.
The Bermuda Triangle.
There's so many varieties of gouache, it's hard to explain. So this one, it is opaque, and yes, it is resoluble. Now, with this particular gouache, they did not say that they had primaries included in this set. They gave you 2 reds, 1 blue, and 1 yellow. So I have my blue and my yellow set as far as my primaries were concerned. It's a yellow light and the Prussian blue. But out of the 2 reds, I went for the more kind of purpley tone rather than this one, because this one had a little bit more orange tones to it, which would be great for an orange, but not great for a purple. But as you can see right here, even my yellow is not, I can tell that that's not a pure yellow. It has a little bit of a tint to it, which I would guess is probably more of a blue. It seems a little bit cooler than it should be. But you can see my colors here are not as vibrant as, say, this one from Holbein. You can really see the difference in the colors. Huge difference right here in the purple. But it comes with a purple. So you don't actually have to mix your colors, which is great. But as far as primaries are concerned, they don't really provide the primaries, but you know, we'll write them anyway. Yellow light, alizarin crimson, and Prussian blue. Those are the three colors that I used to get these different colors right here. Although, I mean, that green, it's quite beautiful, and it is very similar to the, this is, I think, the green deep that we mixed, but then you get another green. So, I mean, again, you don't have to mix them, but it's just good to know what your paints can do. So that was the Jack Richardson, make sure, yeah, I think I got all the details on that. There's so many that I had to write down all my notes. All right, any questions on that so far?
Couple.
Okay.
Would a drop or two of water keep the paint from cracking in the palettes?
No, because your water is going to evaporate and then you're going to be right back where you were. So, while you're working on it, when it's wet to begin with, and you squeeze out some wet paint on your palette, it's totally fine. It doesn't crack or anything. It's only when it fully cures, and to be honest, the blobs of paint that I've been putting on all of my palettes, they took a solid day and a half to dry, I would guess, because it was just such a thick amount of paint. So some of these dried a little faster than others, but that one in particular definitely took a while. So that is Jack Richardson, and oh, I did want to write chalk with a question mark because I don't know. Lasco. Is that how we pronounce it? Lasco?
Yeah, sure.
Let's go. Let's go. These guys.
Oh, it was Laco.
Laco. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing everything wrong. It's words.
Depends on where you are, how it's pronounced.
It does.
Sure.
It does. All right, so these guys are in a really fun. Excuse me. Didn't happen. These are in a really fun bottle that you can shake very easily or throw. Or throw at somebody if you're very angry. But the body of these bottles are very squeezy. So if you wanted to squeeze them out like I did right here, then you can. Now, as you can see, these blobs of paint really leveled down quite a bit, which is most gouache, you're not going to get a whole lot of brush strokes with them. They usually level out pretty fast as far as, you know, it's not an impasto kind of paint. Now this one, it does actually say it Tempera on the bottle. Now, does that make this Tempera? No, not specifically, because it also has, it says Tempera color, but then it says gouache, I believe, over here. Yeah, so it has some kind of confusing information on the bottle as far as like whether or not you're looking for a Tempera or a gouache. Now, when I looked for the binder was an acrylic modified Tempera. That was actually what it was, the only thing I could find listed. So, acrylic modified Tempera. So that, in my mind, means that it is probably a tempera paint with some kind of that like glutinous binder, similar to egg yolk, mixed in with some kind of an acrylic polymer. So with that, whether or not it re-wets becomes a big question. So let's jump straight into it. Because it has that acrylic polymer in there, but it re-wets. How confusing is that? I would assume that probably has something to do with I'm mixing white, like you're gonna see that on the paper here. Let's do a little bit of pink, or the magenta. It's not pink, it's magenta. Yeah, I made it pick straight up, and I had a little bit of yellow on my paintbrush, so it's not the true magenta. But you can see it is picking the pigments right back up. It's honestly not picking the pigments up as much as I would expect from a traditional gouache, but that's probably having to do with that acrylic modified binder. So, as you can see on my my tester swatches here, super opaque. So they do pass the opacity test. They are resoluble, but not a ton, but they are resoluble. And then the straight out of the tube, the consistency straight out of the tube. Let's pour this blue one. Is quite creamy. So this guy, it's creamy, but it also, like, it strings like a weird consistency, which also reminds me of like honey, which straight out of the tube you get a lot more of that beautiful pigment. So like this might be one of those paints that I use more so when it's wet rather than when it's dry. I probably wouldn't keep this in a travel like a travel watercolor set. That wouldn't be, I'd probably be fighting. So like here, I'll give a good test here. This is my dry section of my blue, and that's my wet, and I'm not touching the wet. I'm only using the dry. So I mean, it does pick up a good amount of the pigment, but as you can see, this is the dry, this is the wet. That's a huge difference. So if I'm looking for really, really, really opaque colors, which is what I did with my swatches, that was using the wet paint. I would probably not use it dry. So that is last go. Let's go. All right, that's just gonna go on the floor. Running out of space. There's so many paints. We've only got through 3. Oh, here, creamy, but it's like honey. It's the consistency. Oh, and I forgot. Sorry, primaries. This does not come in a set. I actually ordered them separately, so I just chose the ones that appeared to be the typical primaries, which was lemon yellow, magenta, and cobalt blue. And they gave me a pretty decent mix here. But that purple is quite light, which makes me believe that there was white mixed into the pigments. And when I looked, yes, every color that I had in here has a white pigment in there. So it has, I believe, a white pigment as the opacifier. So even though the binder is an acrylic modified tempera, they might have added some kind of a chalk because of that tempera kind of aspect of it, but I would assume that there's probably white in almost every single one of their colors. I haven't double checked, could be wrong on that one, but every color that I used here has white paint in it. So that lemon yellow is a yellow mixed with white, which is good to know, especially if you're looking for dark, deep colors. You're gonna have a hard time mixing them unless you get them straight out of the tube. So I use lemon yellow, magenta. I think my handwriting is getting worse as I go on. Blue. So that was the primaries I used here. And let's jump into the next one. Liquitex Acryl Gouache. This one is a tricky. And you know what? Actually, I'm going to take this and just flip it so you guys have more of the white color. All right. So this guy, they have some really, really, really beautiful colors. But this is the primary set, so you get a white and black, emerald green, the primary blue, primary red, and primary yellow. So like I did with all my other ones, squeezed out all the paints here. This is called an acrylic gouache, which makes me believe that there's an acrylic polymer in it, which makes me understand. Here, let me do the black here. Nothing. It does not re-wet at all. So this paint right here is already completely dry, and there is no re-wetting. Like there's no solubility to these paints at all. So the reason why is because, and the binder is again one of those things where it's proprietary information. I couldn't get that. I would say that this is an acrylic. It is not a gouache at all, because a gouache should re-wet just like a watercolor. This is a flat matte acrylic. So I would assume that there's some kind of an acrylic polymer. But I could not get that confirmed. So it is not resoluble at all. Now the opacity on these, I did actually have to look this up because I did notice that it did vary from each one. Now they actually did address this. The reason why is because they wanted to have consistency with the fluidity and the flexibility of their paints. So if they made everything as opaque as possible, you would have had to kind of give up those two other aspects. So some of the opacity of these paints do vary ever so slightly, but like, you know, the yellow, even though that's not an opaque yellow, it's still a really beautiful color, and it still flows like all the others. It has that consistency to it. Now, I think that's it on that one. Yeah. Oh, sorry. The consistency of the paint. Let's use green, because it's not a primary. So the consistency of the paint, straight out of the tube. Sorry, I'm trying to fly through these because we have just so much and we're already running low on time. It is extremely creamy and quite fluid. Now I do know that they say that this is one of those paints that you do not have to mix water in. You can use it straight on your paper just as it is. You can kind of water it down a little bit for a little bit more of a wash, but you don't have to mix it in with water. It's just ready to go straight out of the tube. But I would say it's probably, again, in between that like melted butter consistency and frosting. So it's kind of right in that weird creamy kind of gooey stage. So creamy, but it is thinner. And the opacity is varies. Now the primaries that we have here, I was actually very surprised with these because they give you the primary colors, primary yellow, red, and blue. That red, again, is not the typical primary red that I would be used to, because primary red that I'm used to is a magenta, pink. This is a bright red, which is awesome as far as a bright red, but it actually mixes really, really well. I was pleasantly surprised. So these are your different primaries. Again, they just call them primary red, yellow, and blue. But they do mix quite nicely together. Primary yellow, red, and blue. Okay. Sorry, my handwriting is getting worse and worse on there. Those are the Liquitex acrylic. It's not an acryl gouache, but acrylic. All right, so let me put it down there, and I'm getting more space. It's beautiful. All right, so the next one we have is Lucas. Lucas is up next. Now these guys, here it is. They come in a packaging like this. Here, let me actually turn it upside down so you guys can see it. Sorry, there's also a really bad glare. This is the, sorry, glare. This is the packaging, and once you open it up, you get a set of 12 tubes. This is the set that it comes in, so you get a lot of different colors, which is really beautiful. And again, I squeezed all of my paints out onto my palette here. Now let me show you the swatches. Now I'm actually seeing this white right here, and I'm wondering if I had something on my paintbrush when I actually did that swatch, because it seems a little not bright white, which is a definite solid possibility because I did all of these swatches. There was just so many. Here, I'm just gonna put these last two here. There were a lot of swatches, 99 to be exact, I counted. So when it comes to these, let's go for the consistency first. So right now I'm squeezing out the primary red, primary red. Straight out of the tube, it is a nice creamy consistency. Get my brush clean here. Oh, this apron is coming in handy, I tell you what. All right, so there it is dry, and then here it is nice and wet. As you can see, actually I do wonder if you can see, this is the same color. So as it dries, it actually darkens quite a bit. And that's the one thing with gouache, is that the way that it dries is sometimes the lighter colors dry darker and the darker colors dry lighter. It is just depending on the brand and the binder and the opacifier and what they mix in. So straight out of the tube though, the consistency, this is actually what I would call like frosting. It's quite thick. There's a reason for it. So it's creamy, but it's more like frosting. So the reason for that, the binder in this paint is a gum arabic, which is the standard for watercolors, but it also has dextrin in it, which is a starch, which thickens your paint without changing the color at all. It just kind of makes it a little bit thicker. So that's what this is, gum arabic and dextrin. Now, the opacity on these, let me double check. Yeah, this didn't have any kind of a variation when it came to my opacities. They, right there in that mass tone, you actually can kind of ignore that because I splattered some water on there, which will explain that it re-wets, but yeah, all of these paints are very, very opaque. So yes. Now resoluble, and this is that, remember this is the wet paint that I had on my paintbrush. Let me grab some of that same color on the dry. So this is my dry palette up here. So that's where I put the wet paint. Here's my dry palette. Now as I'm getting this re-wet, I can see that color shift. It's going back more towards like what it looks like straight out of the tube. But it picks up the pigment really nice. So this is what I would expect from a gouache. Straight out of the tube, when it's really, really wet, it's a little bit, just a little bit darker and a little bit more opaque as far as the colors. But once you re-wet it, it still has a beautiful brilliancy to it. So I'm very happy as far as like the resolubility for that. It is a yes. Yes. Now, primaries on these. This one, again, it kind of seems a little bit lighter to me. Now, I wanted to double check before I tell you this. Yes, the primary blue did have some titanium white mixed into it, which might be why that green looks a little bit white-ish, like a little bit chalkier than I would expect. But at the same time, like that orange doesn't quite look like a brilliant orange to me, which makes me think that that yellow might have something to do with it. But as far as primaries, again, you're getting a really solid mixture as far as what's, you know, coming from the set. And again, you get all the different colors, so you don't have to mix them, but if you wanted to, you can. So these are called primary yellow, red, and blue. So that is the Lucas paint. While I'm cleaning that up, any questions?
Yeah.
What you got?
Go back there. I had a couple questions about if the permanence and light fast ratings of them.
That varies from brand to brand again. And it's one of those things that I would love to sit here and talk with you guys about through all of them. We just don't we have not enough time. Now I can pull.
It is on the website.
Yeah, that's the one thing with the code, the JL187. If you go to the website and type that code in, you can pull up every single one of these, and light fast ratings should be on, like, listed on the website. There's a little tech notes, I think it's a yellow icon next to each item that you can click on and get some information on, or you can click into the sub page. If you guys have questions on how to find that information and you just simply cannot, feel free to message me on the Jerry's Live group. Or actually, it would probably be better if you go through my own host page, which is Emmy, host of Jerry's Live. We can interact straight one-on-one there, so you guys don't have to worry about trying to go through. Customer service is great, though. My guys in customer service, they are fantastic, and they can also help you. But if you're looking for that information, we have it listed on the website, but there's just too many. Now, let's go to the next, M. Graham, which is this adorable little set here. I love their packaging. It's so cute. So this is the basic set of 5 colors. We got our primaries, and how are we looking on time? I know we're
about 15 minutes left.
All right. I'm actually surprised at how much we got through. Now again, this one is doing the same thing that my other palette was doing, where it's like, it's not quite attaching to this palette just because this is a non-stick palette. It's meant to do that. If you don't want it to do this, you need a different palette that doesn't stick. Or I believe you can probably even take like a bit of rough sandpaper to this, and it would give it something to kind of really grab onto. But then you're taking the non-stick out of this non-stick palette. So just be aware. Now this one has 5 different colors, your primaries, and a white and a black. So the binder on this is gum arabic. Now it also has honey in it, which is very similar to gum arabic, but it allows it to kind of retain that moisture level, which is the entire point of mixing honey in there. So let's do, I love that naphtha red, but it just does not ever come out of my paintbrush. It really sticks on your brush. So I'm going to use the cobalt blue, just so I don't taint the rest of my paints that I'm showing you here. Straight out of the jar, it is very consistent between all of these colors. It's very creamy, but because it has that honey in there, it moves just like honey. Like, it's stringy, which is, I mean, it's not a bad thing. It's just, and it's also got that, like, that thickness of honey, which is, it's just kind of funny to feel in a paint. So, straight out of the jar, here, let me push this over so you guys can see it a little bit better. Or straight out of the tube, it is, again, beautifully pigmented. And as you can see, I just wanted to double check that was the right one. It's darker than when it dries. So this is the same color. It's just this mass tone, as you can see, it dries just a little bit lighter. And it's just one of those color shifts that gouache is a funny kind of medium that does that. So that's why you need to swatch your paints. You need to swatch your paints. So straight out of the tube, it is creamy, but like honey, which is similar to the Lascaux, but I would say Lascaux is a little bit thicker. This has a little bit more of that, like, honey kind of feel to it. You ever try to stir honey into your tea, you know, that, like, kind of almost sticky feel. So let's see, I'll write down the binder in just a second. Let's do how much does it re-wet. Now again, this is not really stuck to my palette, so it's a little bit harder for me to kind of re-wet here, but it re-wets really nicely. Again, this is one of those things that I expect in a gouache. When I need it to re-wet, it really does. It picks that pigment right back up. So straight out of the tube, and this is from a dry pile of gouache that's been sitting there for a week. So it picks it right back up. So it is resoluble. The binder is, what did I say, gum arabic and honey, right? Just to double check, yes. Now the opacity, as you can see between all of them, it technically can vary. Like that red is a little bit, and so the red and the yellow are not as opaque as the blue, the white, and the black. But that one is just because they only use opaque pigments in their paints. So that one is, there's no additional opacifiers added to it. They just packed in a whole lot of really opaque pigment to their paints. So because this mineral is a little bit less opaque than this one, that's where you get that slight variation. But we are going to write that it does vary. And the primaries. So this one, they have the azo yellow, the naphthol red, and the cobalt blue. They do mix really nicely. And that purple is really hard to see. So you know what I'm gonna do? Because it's gouache, right? It will re-wet, and I can even pull it back out so you guys can kind of see. I probably added a little bit more cobalt blue in there than I needed to, but it is actually a beautiful purple. But it's just really hard to see when it's that dark. But they gave me a really nice mix of colors when it came to all three of those. And again, not what I would expect as a primary red, because it's boom red right in your face, not magenta, but it gave you a really nice orange and a really nice purple. So that's azo yellow, the naphthol red, which I always misspell, so I'm just gonna keep going. I always forget there's another H in there right after the P. And cobalt blue. So that is the M-gram. Just make sure that I got all of them. Oh, the other thing with these is that each paint only has one pigment. That's why you're getting such a really nice mixability with the primaries, is that each one only has one pigment in the paint. So it's not a mix of different things together. All right, and that was M-gram. And actually, I can probably keep that over here on the table. And I'm going to grab a different piece of paper. And this right here is the Fabriano watercolor paper that I just ripped because I'm trying to go quick. But it is a color block, so it is actually glued on all four sides except for just this one corner where you can pick it up and pull. And as long as you're not pulling it as fast as possible like I just did, you won't rip it. But this is my favorite watercolor block because it keeps it from buckling. So now we go into Marie's Extra Fine Gouache. This one has a lot of different colors in there. This is a set of, what is it, 18? Yeah, 18. Now these are, I believe this one, I actually did find out the binder. This is a plant-based glue. I don't know what kind of plants, so I know you're probably gonna ask, but I asked them and they told me it was a plant-based glue, which is a binder that has been found. Like a glue-based binder is usually what you would find in a tempera paint, and I'm talking like the kids' tempera paint. Now, again, that does not make this a kid's paint because it is a little bit, I wouldn't consider this a kid's paint at all. just because of the different variations in color, and I believe there's, I honestly didn't look up whether or not it was a non-toxic paint. The Jack Richardson, the gouache that comes in the big jars that look like tempera, those are non-toxic. This, I don't know with 100% certainty, unless I would look. But they have a ton of colors in here. And it just keeps going. I'm running out of space. So many different colors. Now this one, straight out of the tube, let's grab Cerulean Blue. Consistency on this guy. Is quite creamy again. So, I mean, the consistency between all the different paints, it's hard for me to tell you that without like that feel when it's like in your hands, but they're all pretty similar. They all kind of go between that like melted butter and like the frosting. This one, I would say, is more towards like the melted butter. Again, it's pretty creamy, but it has a nice creamy consistency, but it's pretty easily spread. And it is very pigmented, as you can see with this blue color, which has now become one of my favorites. Look at that color. Love that color. So that was straight out of the tube, and that is creamy, but it is on the thinner side. So straight out of the tube, let's grab the same color because I want to compare to see how much of that pigment it picks right back up. Does pretty well. Now some of these I wasn't able to test before I got onto the show, so this is a genuine reaction. I am pleasantly surprised with how well that picked up. It's again a slight difference between the straight out of the tube when it's still wet and the dry pile of gouache that I just picked right back up. But as far as the pigment load that came off of that dry paint, I'm very happy with that. So it is resoluble. And as far as the opacity, yeah, this is the one that I couldn't find anything as whether or not they use natural pigments or not. I actually couldn't find pigment numbers for these at all, which might be something that I have to kind of dig for a little bit further. But if I find them, I will list them for you guys. But these, I do see that the opacity does kind of vary. Like the yellow is not as opaque as, say, like this green right here. Is this ultramarine? Yeah, this is an ultramarine blue, and I can still see that black line through it. It's probably not easy for you guys to see, but it's in my hand and I can see it. Now the other thing I can see right now is that it's not fully matte. It does have a slight shine to it. So be aware of that if you are looking for something that is super opaque and flat matte. This is not the one that you're going to want, but it is, as far as a gouache, I gotta say the price point on these are really low and very reasonable. So if you're wanting to try and test out kind of a sort of gouache paint, this is a really nice start. But again, it's plant-based glue. So I don't know if I would technically call this a gouache. So these and the Primaries. This is another one of those paints that did not actually call out the fact that they put Primaries in here. Now I will say on the tubes they do have numbers that correspond with the name of the paint. That does not correspond to a pigment code, so it doesn't mean anything as far as calling out the pigments that are in them. I couldn't tell you what's in here, but I was very pleasantly surprised. Now even if I didn't need to mix all these in, I have 18 colors. I don't actually have to mix them. I can just grab a really nice fuchsia or this purple right here, which is, I believe, mauve, and the Cerulean Blue, which is a really nice teal color going on. So I mean, it's got a nice variety, but the ones that I used here are lemon yellow, rose, and ultramarine blue. So they give you a pretty nice mix, and that purple that it mixed together, very pretty. So lemon yellow, rose, and what did I say, ultramarine blue. So that is Marie's. And all 18 of their colors. So many! I feel like we're gonna play with, like, we have like 13 decks of cards with these. I'm gonna actually leave this over here. Okay, now we get into Turner. With Turner, we have two different kinds. We have the Turner Acryl Gouache, and we have Turner Design Gouache. They are very different. So, let's start with the Turner Acryl Gouache, because we are going in ABC order. So again, they do have smaller sets of these. I'm sure I'm like running out of time, so I'm not gonna really like put all these out. But this is the 18 set, yes, 18 set that I had gotten from the Mystery Art Box show. So I figured I might as well just reuse these again. And I swatched every single one of them, and I will say, without a shadow of a doubt, every single one of these is insanely opaque. So I can tell you, absolutely, yes, it is opaque. The other thing I know about this paint right here is that it is concentrated right out of the tube. Let's go with violet. Right out of the tube, it's pretty creamy, but it is a concentrated paint. I just happen to know that because I'm very familiar with this paint, and I know in order to paint with it, you need to mix water in. I usually get my brush wet and start mixing it in just straight on my palette to get a nice melted butter consistency. And even with that consistency with the water, that's how you get those really, really opaque paints, the coverage that you want. So that is straight out of the tube, the violet. Now, the resolubility of this is kind of put into question because this is an acryl gouache. And I'm sure you're probably sitting there going, it's probably like that Liquitex. It's not, but it is. But it's not. So this is, I know it has an acrylic polymer as its binder. Now, when they made this, with an acrylic polymer, there's a maximum level of pigment that you can put into your paints. They exceeded it. So when you start exceeding that level, your acrylic polymer can no longer act as an acrylic polymer because it can't hold everything together. There's not enough acrylic in there. So that's why you can ever so slightly, and I mean if you scrub the paint, it does have a little bit, or it should have a little bit. Maybe I just picked the wrong paint here. Yeah, it's kind of picking it up a little bit. It really doesn't pick up much. I can see just a little bit of pigment. I don't even think it's coming up on the camera. I can see just a tiny tinge of color right there, but not enough to where I would consider this resoluble. This, if you put this out on your palette and let it dry, you're not going to be able to paint with it. Do not do that. You are going to be crying over spilt paint because that's exactly what you just did, is you painted your palette and that's the only thing you're going to paint. This is the paint that is, it is an acrylic, so think of it like that. But they call it gouache because it does have that insanely flat matte finish. So no resolubility. Now the consistency is nice and creamy, but concentrated. So with water, it's like melted butter. All right, now the primaries that I mixed over here, again, this is one of those ones where they did not actually call out primaries. They do have pigments listed for these different colors, which again I can upload for you guys, but I just use the permanent lemon, the carmine, and the cobalt blue hue. So they actually did give me a good mix, but again, you don't really need to mix at all. There's no need. They have so many colors. Carmine and cobalt blue. So that was Turner Acryl Gouache. Now the Turner Design Gouache, like I said, very, very different, because when I think of a traditional gouache, this is what I think. So the word design doesn't mean anything as far as like acrylic is concerned. Again, I know we're running out of time, so let me just kind of flop these out here. So this is the set of 12. I think I used these for another previous show. I think probably the hair episode where I was painting someone's hair. So I just use, again, the same set. I know it does come in other sets, and you can also buy the individual tubes. But when where this is concerned, the binder is a pure gum Arabic, so it's watercolor. It's gonna be able to pick right back up. Now, straight out of the tube, let's use, why not, Permanent Green Light. Straight out of the tube, it is actually very reminiscent of the Turner Acryl Gouache. It has that nice creamy consistency. And once you start moving it around with a little touch of water on your brush, you can get really, really opaque washes. And as you can see on all of these, the opacity level on that, like that line is just gone all the way down. It is so opaque, and the surface on that when it dries, flat matte. There's no reflectability, there's no shine to that whatsoever. So opacity is absolutely, and resolubility, I already know because I've used this so many times before. Again, I'm going to use the same color. And this is, again, one of those things where the paints have dried and they're cracking straight out of here, but this is a non-stick palette, so it's not going to stick. Now, this is just insanely opaque. Again, I'm not using a whole lot of water, and I'm not really like scrubbing it, but it's picking up that pigment so well. So it is absolutely resoluble. Now, the consistency is creamy, just like the other ones. The primaries. These are the ones, again, they didn't call out that they use primaries. They didn't tell you which one is a primary. So again, I just chose. I used the Permanent Lemon, the Rose Violet, and Cyan Blue. They gave me a really nice mix. And again, you don't have to mix. You got so many colors. But if you just want to choose just a couple of colors and just get those tubes, you can, and you can get a lot of mixes out of them. So Permanent Lemon. Rose Violet. And what did I use? Cyan Blue. One more. How are we doing on time? I'm sure we're over.
Yeah, you're about 10 minutes over, but it's okay.
Yep. There's just so many gouaches, and they're all so different. But we have one more left, guys. And then, of course, if you guys have any questions, I can maybe answer them if we have enough time and enough people asking a million questions. So, the last but not least is Winsor Newton. Now, this is a gouache that I am very familiar with because this is the one I started off with when I was using gouache for the first time ever in school. So this is something that I know. I can tell you right now, just looking at these, crazy opaque. The opacity on these is just really, really, really nice. So it is, yes, opaque. Consistency straight out of the tube. Let's do the blue one because well, actually, nope, okay, that is dry. For a second there, I thought I didn't let that dry. Consistency straight out of the tube. Is very, very creamy. Now this is again on the thicker side, so it is thicker than I would say Turner Acryl Gouache. Again, that doesn't make one better than the other, it's just personal preference at that point. So the thickness of that again means if I lay this down straight out of the tube, I probably would mix it with a little bit of water. Just because to get that like flow kind of going. But the color is absolutely insane. Look at that blue. So it is creamy, but it's on the thicker side. And actually, yeah, the Turner Design Gouache was on the thinner, straight out of the tube. Now the binder on this one is also pure gum arabic. So it's just like the Design Gouache. They didn't add anything else. Now resolubility, let's check that. Clean my brush off here. Now my little paint blob is moving around on me. Stay. That is, again, the one thing that I would do is probably take this and stick it on, if I can pick it up, it's a little wet now. Stick it in a blob of freshly squeezed blue paint so it doesn't move around on me. But I can tell you, like, I have blue on my hands right now. It's definitely going to pick right back up. Try not to hit the wet paint that I just squished that down into. But as you can see, again, it's very consistent as far as picking that pigment right back up. But it's gum arabic. Gum arabic is essentially a sugar, so you add water to it, it's gonna kind of move around on you. So, resoluble is yes. And last but not least, we have the primaries. Now this one does come in the set where it's white, black, and I think this is the basic set where it gives you the 3 primaries, white, black, and the brilliant green. So it gives you all those different colors. But if you do mix your primaries together, you do get some really pretty colors. Now, again, this is one of those things where I'm very familiar with this. So when I look at this, that is a really brilliant orange, really brilliant, excuse me, really brilliant purple, and a really, really nice green. So they didn't muddy when you start mixing them together, and they gave you some really solid colors. And they call them primary red, yellow, and blue. And that was the last of the gouache. Now I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions as like one compared to the other. Do you got a ton of things for me right now, Katie, or should I go back through all the questions later?
Well, definitely that. But I do have some questions for you.
Yes, shoot.
The first one kind of is, I think people are confused, like, why would you use this over acrylic or over watercolor?
Well, watercolor is transparent. If you are trying to do, and this is one of those things where I'm extremely familiar with gouache because it was kind of more introduced in the illustration side of art. So like children's book illustrations, when you're doing different comics for a newspaper or just illustrations like that in general, there's a lot of different layers, or you might want to lay down and have a flat matte surface. So when you scan it in to be reproduced as a print, it doesn't have that reflective problem where acrylic is going to have some kind of a reflectiveness to it unless you start putting down a matte varnish kind of on your paintings. Now, if you want to use watercolor because you want that transparency, go for it. If you want to have the opaque ability to kind of fully cover your different colors, this is where you'd like to go. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, even acrylics aren't 100% opaque. Some acrylics are also transparent, but it depends on the acrylic. Any other questions?
Oh yeah, I've got a couple.
Okay. What you got?
Real quick, but I have another one that goes back to them. But
okay.
They were asking about the Turner Design Gouache. Are those single pigments?
The Turner Design Gouache.
I know the Turner Acryl Gouache is not.
No, and it always depends on the color. Mm-hmm. The three that I used for the Design Gouache, the Rose Violet is a single pigment. That was the Quinacridone Magenta. The Cyan Blue is a combination. It's phthalo cyan and Hansa Yellow. I was actually kind of surprised, which would explain why, where's my, yeah, here, with the Design Gouache. That would explain why this right here is more of like a teal kind of color because it has the yellow mixed in. So it kind of leans more towards the green, which is why I was very surprised that I got such a purple. I thought that was going to be very muddy because I thought that yellow was going to tint the blue and the red and kind of give you mud. But I was pleasantly surprised there. And then the yellow for that Design Gouache is again a combination of two different yellows and titanium white, which is why it got so brilliant. But again, I don't know the ratios of those. They might have added just the tiniest amount of white just to kind of bring it up just a notch, but not enough to make any of these kind of, or these two mixes or the yellow chalky, if that makes sense. So again, they didn't call them out as primaries, but I believe a good portion of their pigments, I mean, all of the pigments are listed on Jerry's website. Again, if you go to the Tech Notes button, it'll give you the information there, but, and it's also written straight on your tube of paint. So, the majority of these, I think it's on the back. Ooh, you guys are gonna have me looking for pigment colors, or pigment coats. Nope, it's on the front. Take it back. So yeah, like the permanent green is a combination of two different colors. Phthalo green and Hansa yellow. So like it's a good combination. I don't see one of these in here that has a single pigment. Except for the Rose Violet. Yeah. And titanium white. Yes, go for it. I'll sit here and look at paint all day.
Okay. How do these go with, say, pastels? We've had questions about colored pencils. Can you use them for underpaintings for oil paintings? Can you use them in conjunction with acrylics? How do they play with all the others?
Yes. Yes, they absolutely play well with others. The one thing, that's why I lean towards the acryl gouache when it comes to mixing in it with other things that you're going to be brushing it on. Like if you want to go on top of this and use an acrylic, I would use the acryl gouache just because I don't want my layers moving. The Design Gouache or any of the other really traditional gouaches, they are still going to be resoluble even after they're dry on here. So like if I were to take acrylic and start going over top of this, sorry, I just did that off camera, but you see how now every brush stroke is pulling my pigments. So if you're going to start using a medium on top of this that requires you to brush a wet media on top of it, you're going to move your pigments. Just be fully aware. Unless you use something like an acrylic gouache, that Turner Acryl Gouache, or even the Liquitex, where it's just a flat acrylic. Those are the two that will not move on you. Now, as far as dry media, like colored pencils or pastels, absolutely use whatever gouache you want. You're not gonna have a really big issue unless you start applying things wet. Like if you use a pastel and you apply it wet, that's where you're gonna have a problem. But yeah, it'll absolutely take it, which, you know, being a flat matte surface, it's gonna be really nice for colored pencils. I've done that before, and I actually, that reminds me, you guys have to join me next week because I use the Turner Acryl Gouache as a base for my oil pastels. So, and just as a reminder, if you guys want to paint along with me next week, because I'm going to actually be doing art, not just talking about art supplies, I'm going to teach you guys how to do this. Now, the base of this panel, I use the jet black Turner Acryl Gouache. So it goes on super flat, dark, beautiful black color. It looks like a black hole, almost like velvet. You can actually kind of see, I did a really thin wash on the sides here, and it is just, it's so dark. But I ended up going on top of it with my oil pastel. So that's where, like, it's not gonna be a big issue even if I'd use the traditional gouache, because I'm using a drawing media. Now, if I start going in there and I have different layers of the gouache, like the design gouache where it's resoluble, and then I start going in and then I start using solvent or pigments or water or something that's wet, that's where it's gonna start picking it back up and you're gonna have issues. If that makes, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
But join me next week.
Okay.
That's all.
Couple short questions real quick.
Okay.
Which one of these would you consider, which of the brands would you consider professional quality?
Oh, okay. Holbein. Sorry, Jack Richardson. I would consider this like a kid's paint. It's not a kid's paint, but in my mind, it's a tempera, and tempera just kind of feels like kid's paint. But that's just my own personal opinion. It doesn't make it an actual kid's paint. It's also non-toxic, so that might have something to do with it. All right, so Holbein, Lasco, Liquitex, Lucas, M. Graham, Turner, Winsor Newton. Those are professional. Now, they're all very different, though. But if you're looking for a very traditional, basic gouache that's just a gouache and not anything like a weird caveat, Winsor Newton, the Turner Design Gouache is a gouache. I'm sorry, Maurice, I'm going to have to skip you. M. Graham is a gouache. Lucas is a gouache. That is not. And Holbein is a gouache. Those are the ones that I would consider to be actual gouaches. Gouaches. Gouache? Gouaches. Gouaches.
Gouaches. Okay.
I think,
Before we go way over.
Yep.
How would you seal these? So if you wanted to paint wet media over top of it, or when you were done with it?
I was hoping someone was going to ask this question. If you're using a traditional gouache and you want to seal them, do not brush anything on. You have to use a spray fixative, something that is it is suspended like in the air and you're spraying it on. Otherwise, if you were to like brush on matte medium or anything like an actual traditional varnish, you're going to move your pigments. It's still going to be soluble, so even your varnishes are going to pick them back up, which is very frustrating if you have this really beautiful design and painting all done, and then you go to varnish it and it's just, that's the only description I can give you, is that it would be very sad. I'd cry. And I have cried because I've done it before. Learn from my mistakes.
Okay, last question.
Yay!
Because it's almost 7 o'clock.
Oh man.
Which one is your favorite? Do you use in your personal works?
I told you I wasn't going to tell you my favorite. but it's Turner. It's the Turner Design Gouache, just because I'm very familiar with it. And that's, again, I've even started with the Winsor Newton. That is a close second to my heart, just because that was the very first gouache that I ever touched in school. And then after that, it was also Holbein, because I love them too. But the Turner Design Gouache has such beautiful colors. And I mean, again, they don't have the true primaries, but they have so many different colors, and they're so pretty. And even the pink is like the rose violet that I used, it's fluorescent. Did you know that? It'll glow in black light. I mean, if you wanted an extra added level of awesome, you can now glow in black light. I should have brought my black light, little flashlight. I could have made it glow. Dang it. But that's my own personal preference. It does not make anything else not better or worse than the others, you know? But guys, I know we are super over time. I'm so glad you stuck with me to the end. That was a lot of gouache, whole lot of gouache, and everything else in between. So that was all the things gouache. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And if you did, hit the like button, because the more you hit that like button, the more this is shared with other artists. And I hope maybe we can get less of a confusion around the word gouache, because there's a whole lot of that. Now, if you guys do anything gouache related, or like I said, you want to tag your gouache things that you've done before, join me on the Facebook Live group, which is Jerry's Live. And now in order to join, do have to answer one question. Don't forget to answer that one question. You have to, just to make sure that you're not a robot, even though I think robots are awesome and should be allowed to join. But make sure you answer that question. Otherwise, you can interact directly with me on my host page, which is Emmy, host of Jerry's Live. And then you can talk to me directly there. I also post updates on things, you know, all throughout the week sometimes. Now, Instagram, make sure to tag me, and my handle is misscakes.art. You can also see my own personal art stuff there. And then you can also go to tag Jerry's Artarama. Now, I know there's a lot of different Jerry's Artarama accounts. It's just the one that says Jerry's Artarama, not Jerry's Artarama of Nashville or Miami or anything like that. Now, if you do anything gouache related, make sure to also tag the class code, which is JL187. That makes it a lot easier for me to find. And of course, join me next week for Oil Pastel. It's gonna be a lot of fun, and I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of questions as far as all the things oil pastel. So that was everything. Thank you guys so much for joining me.